Today I'm going to talk a bit about ursusmaritimus, which you probably better know as the polar bear. Ursusmaritimus is the scientific name for the polar bear. Literally translated, it means sea bear, which is really appropriate because these guys are marine mammals. They depend on the ocean as their habitat and their main source of food. They live in the Arctic, the northern part of the globe, sort of northern Alaska, Canada, Norway, near the North Pole, anywhere that there's Arctic sea ice. They only live in the north, so they do not live in Antarctica. There's currently about 22 to 31,000 polar bears out there, but scientists are projecting that there's going to be fewer than 10,000 by the year 2050, which is over a two-thirds decline in just over 30 years. The IUCN classifies them as vulnerable for this reason. They're likely to become endangered unless the circumstances threatening their survival and reproduction improve. The major threats to polar bears are these: unsustainable hunting by both trophy hunters and native tribes, industrial expansion, such as the expansion of the oil and gas industry into polar bear habitats, and with that comes human polar bear conflicts, as human habitats and polar bear habitats are kind of meeting in the middle as the oil industry has expanded. It hasn't ended well for polar bears because they are threats to humans. But by far, the biggest issue for polar bears is climate change. A 2016 report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said this: "It cannot be overstated that the single most important action for the recovery of polar bears is to significantly reduce the present level of global greenhouse gas emissions. The sooner global warming and sea ice loss are stopped, the better the long-term prognosis for the species." So to understand a little bit more about how sea ice is affected, we need to know a bit about polar ecosystems. So this graphic on the right demonstrates the levels of sea ice over the past 40 or so years. The lighter colors are years that are further away, and the darker colors here at the bottom are the years that are most recent. So you see back in 1979, we had well over 6 million square miles of sea ice in the spring. But this year, we have barely 5.5 million, a loss of 500,000 square miles of ice. The past 4 years have been the 4 lowest on record. Global climate change is leading to record low levels of sea ice, which is an issue because this is what polar bears need to hunt and get their food source. This is a little sample of how polar bears hunt. I decided to spare you the bloody seal photos. So this is called still hunting, and it's when a polar bear will sit by a hole in the ice and wait for a seal to surface to breathe, and then when it does, it'll pounce, drag it onto the ice, and then eat it. This is a good way of hunting for polar bears because it requires very little energy. They're not moving much. These guys can get as big as 1,500 pounds. We've seen some specimens. They burn over 12,000 calories a day, and they need to eat a lot of food in order to sustain their bodies. So not only is not being able to find enough food an issue, but this is sort of why and how it affects the entire ecosystem. This quote from Tom Brown says, "Algae lingers on the underside of sea ice, and as spring begins, there's a major increase in its growth. It's then eaten by tiny creatures called zooplankton. They are in turn eaten by fish, that are in turn eaten by seals, which are in turn consumed by polar bears. But if algae levels drop, the whole food chain is disrupted." So there's just less food out there in general. And with sea ice at record lows, polar bears have to range further to find seals. They're spending precious energy swimming and wandering in search of their prey, and each day that passes without a kill is a day closer to what can be a fatal spiral. The farther the bears have to travel to get on the ice, the more weight that they can lose. And eventually, as they lose muscle, their chances of hunting success dwindle. This is how that affects polar bears. This is a picture of a starving polar bear taken by photographer Paul Nicklin. And he wrote about this. This is what starvation looks like. The muscles atrophy, no energy, it's a slow, painful death. The simple truth is this: if the Earth continues to warm, we will lose bears and entire polar ecosystems. This large male bear was not old, and he certainly died within hours or days of this moment. But there are solutions. We must reduce our carbon footprint, eat the right food, stop cutting down our forests, and begin putting the earth, our home, first. If we want to save the polar bear, it will require nothing less than drastic and immediate effort. It's possible, but we must start thinking about it now. Thank you.